Hello everyone, welcome to this first Nerdcraft Blender tutorial. I wanted to show you how to make texture coordinates for procedural textures on curve objects using geometry nodes. Why would we want to do that? Well, in order to answer that, we first have to understand how texture coordinates usually work in Blender. Just like in your 3D scene, your object's texture space has three dimensions, X, Y, and Z, represented by red, green, and blue, respectively. And in the middle, they're all at a value of 0, which is visualized as black. But if you go 1 meter along those dimensions, it fades to a value of 1, or their respective color when viewed together, and at 2 and 3 meters, it fades to 2 and 3. And on the other side, it goes into negative numbers, which looks black, and the texture space uses these vectors. And wherever the surface of your object intersects with that texture space, that is the part of the texture that part of the surface will receive. The problem is, if we have a curve, but then we change the shape of our curve, well, you'll notice that it slides through this texture space. The texture does not stick with its surface. So what we want to do is create texture coordinates that are actually stuck to the curve, as it were. This is how we're going to accomplish that. We're going to take the parameter that goes along the length of the curve and turn that into our Z vector. And then we're going to take the parameter that goes around the circumference of our curve and manipulate that into our X and Y vectors. In our new Blender scene, we could certainly do this with the default cube by just creating a curve in geometry nodes, but I'm actually going to create a real curve. So Shift A, add a Bezier curve, and I'm actually going to go over to my geometry nodes. I have geometry nodes over on this side, and I have shader nodes over here so that we can visualize some things. The first thing we need to do with this curve is give it thickness. We're going to create a new geometry nodes, Shift A, and S to search for curve to mesh. Now we need a profile. What shape is its thickness going to have? We're just going to use a circle. So Shift A, S to search for circle, and make sure you select the curve circle. We need it to be a curve. Plug that curve into the profile. Our curve now has thickness. Now we're going to capture our attributes to turn into our dimensions. Shift A, S to search for capture attribute. First, we're going to capture our length attribute. This has to be placed while our curve is still a curve and not after it's been turned into a mesh, because this data is only available while it's still a curve. Shift A, S to search for spline parameter. This has data related to our curve. We could use factor or use length. Length gives us a value of 0 at the base of the curve, and however long the curve is, if the curve is 8 meters long, then at the end of it, it'll fade to a value of 8. Whereas factor, it starts at 0 as well, but at the end of the curve, it fades to a value of 1 no matter how long or short the curve is. We are eventually going to use both, but I'm going to use factor right now. Let me show you what we're aiming for. We are going to be creating this node. We can adjust the resolution of our curve circle. We can fill the caps so that it's not hollow. And we can also fix our texture coordinates. If this fixed is not checked, then the texture is dynamic. The longer our curve becomes, the more texture there is to come in. And likewise, if we adjust its thickness, it expands into that texture, but it still conforms to the overall shape of the curve. On the other hand, if fixed is checked, if we change the shape of our curve, you'll notice that the texture stretches with it. And likewise, if we change the thickness of the curve, the texture remains where it is. That's what we're aiming for, and you will be able to drag and drop this node into any project that you're working on, and you'll never have to do this work again. If you're supporting me on Patreon, you'll get to download the file, and you won't even have to follow this tutorial unless you want to see my thinking behind what happens here. So we have our Z attribute started, but we can't really use it yet. Shift A, S to search for store named attribute. We want to put this after it becomes a mesh, and we're going to transfer this data over here so that we can use it. And actually, we can already use this in other places in geometry nodes, but here we'll be able to use it in texture space. So we want to give this a name that we can use. Let's call it curve vector. Press enter to confirm that name. We want to create a material so that we can visualize what's happening. We'll just use the material that was on our default cube. We'll get rid of principled. Shift A, S to search for attribute. And now type in the same name, curve vector, and I'm going to hold Z down and switch to material preview so we can start to see what's happening. With the Node Wrangler add-on turned on, if it's not turned on, edit and preferences, Go to add-ons and search for Wrangler. That gives us some more shortcut keys for nodes and makes things easier. With Control-Shift, click once or twice, we should start seeing our vectors, but we don't yet. I've recorded this tutorial enough times that by now I know I need to Shift-A, search for a set material, put in the name of that material so that our nodes know what material to use. We don't really see anything happening yet. Copy that, paste that. Okay, I didn't have the name typed in correctly. We can see it going from a value of 0 on this side and going to a value of 1 over here. I'm actually going to create an object that we can compare and imitate. Shift-A, add a mesh cylinder. I'm going to move it down 1 meter. I'm going to add a material, get rid of principal, but this time we're going to Shift-A, S to search for coordinates, texture coordinates. Shift-Control until we visualize the object texture coordinates. These are the coordinates that we're trying to replicate on our curve. In order to match that, I'm going to select our curve, tab into edit mode, rotate it around the y-axis, holding the control key down exactly 90 degrees, move it up 1 meter. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to select these 4 and Control-G, turn them into a group, and that's going to be that ultimate group that we're going to make. We only have one vector right now. We want to capture another vector that is our x and y. This curved circle that gives our curve its thickness, well, that's a curve too. So we can do the exact same thing. We can copy capture attribute and put it while it's still a curve. Copy this and plug the factor in as well. So we have to plug both of these into this output, but you'll notice we can only do one. We have to do a few things. Press in to bring our options. Scroll down to group here. On this attribute output, we're going to change it from a float to a vector. That way, instead of just storing one value, it can store x, y, and z. Tab out of this group and change our store named attribute from float over to vector as well, so that it can actually receive all 3 of those. We're going to name this to curve vector. Let's call it curve vector. So now, in order to still plug all 3 of these in, Shift-A, S to search for combine x, y, z. Put this over this noodle, put our length into our z, and we're going to put this into our x. We also want another one that's going to be our y-axis, so we're going to copy that over and plug that into our y. These are going to be a little more complicated. So I'm actually going to select these, Control-G, and put them into their own group. Tab out of that to call it curve profile vectors. Inside of here, it's going to get a little more crazy. So tab to go inside. So what I'm going to do in our shaders is Shift-A, S to search for separate X, Y, Z, so we can look at these dimensions one at a time. And we're going to look at the X as it is right now. One thing we're also going to change on the Z. You may not have to do this, but just for visualization purposes, I'm going to change this. I want it to be a value of 0 or black down here at the bottom. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, F3 to search for switch direction. Now that's on the bottom. For the Z, looking at the X, Shift Control, click on that. I actually want this value of 0 to be in the front. Control T to tilt it around, type in -90 degrees in this case. Whatever you're working on, you might not have to do that. I'm just lining it up to compare to our cylinder. I'm also going to take our cylinder and SZ -1 so that the bottom of this one touches the bottom of that side so that we can compare them more easily. So let's tab into our first group, tab into our second group. We have to do some special things because it's starting at a value of 0 here and it's going around in kind of a radial texture to a quarter, to a half, 0.5, 0.75, to 1 over here. But not quite. If you notice, it's actually going to 1 over here and then fading back to black here. We don't want that. We want it to become white exactly when it meets black again. So we have to kind of fake it. And this becomes more apparent if I tab out. Let's add another input and let's control the resolution of our curve from outside this group. If we turn our resolution down to like 3, it goes up to half at this first one, and it goes up to 100% here, where that's not what we want. In this case, we would want it to be 2/3 over here, and then pretend it goes to 100% white over here. I'm going to set that back to 32. Tab into that, and tab into that. So in order to do that, we have to fix our factor a little bit. Duplicate our group input here. We want to access how much resolution our circle has. So I'm going to Shift-A, S to search for circle, curve circle, and I'm going to plug our resolution so that it has an output there, and then get rid of that with X, because we don't actually need that node here, we just need the input. So we're going to tab out of this, and we're going to plug our resolution into our resolution so we can control things with that in this group. Add a math node. Shift A, S to search for math or go to utilities, but I have my own keyboard shortcut. If you click on one of these with the right mouse button, you can assign your own shortcut. And for me, it's Control M for adding a math node. We're going to set this to subtract. We're going to take our resolution and subtract 1. So what was 32 in this case will be 31. Add another math node, set it to divide, and we're going to go the lower number divided by the whole number. So like 31 divided by 32, and that will make this white point like 97%, pretending it's becoming 100% when it reaches black or 0 again. Add another math node, multiply, and we're going to take our factor and multiply it by this number that we've created. I'm going to select all of these and Control J, put them into a frame so it's a bit easier to read, and I'm going to name this fix factor, and I'm going to straighten these up a little bit. So now, if we look at what's happening here, we won't really see much of a difference, but if we turn our resolution down to like 3 again, and if we tap back in, and if we select our multiply that's multiplying our factor, and if we press M to mute it, if we unmute it now, we notice it gets a little bit darker, and that's because it's darker over here at like 2/3 now and pretending it becomes 1 over at black again. Let's turn our resolution back up to like 32. Now what we want to do is multiply this so that it matches down here. So I'm going to select our cylinder, Shift A, S to search for separate XYZ. That way we can just view these dimensions one at a time. And it's not extremely hard. The first time I recorded this tutorial, I made it extremely complicated just to find out there's an easier way of doing it. So what we're going to do, Shift A, search for a map range. We're going to plug this in. Make sure that clamp is turned off. Clamp means the value won't go higher than 1 or lower than 0. Add another math node, and well, let me show you what we're doing first. Just mute this. Right now our texture goes from 0 to 1/4 to 1/2 to 3/4 to 1. But what we actually want it to do is we want it to match down here where it goes from 0 to 1 on this side, back down to 0, and then over to -1 before rising back up to 0. We know that on this side up here, it's 1/4 around. We want that to be 1. What we could do is instead of 1 being turned into 1, we want 0.25 to be turned into 1. We can see it's kind of working, but we notice it's not following along in the middle exactly. Up here, it thinks it's a diagonal surface, but we want it to go from 0 to 1 as if around a curved surface. So what I found we actually have to do, if we unmute this, we want to change this math node over to sine, and this will give us a kind of rising and falling instead of straight. It kind of looks right, but it's not. The reason for that is the sine wave uses pi. We can set this value to pi. Just type in pi. And that doesn't quite work either. It goes over too far. Change our from max to 0.5, as it turns out, and our vectors match perfectly. Now we want to do something similar with the y vector. Let's tidy these up a little bit. Control J, call this x vector. Make sure all are selected, and Shift D, duplicate. We're going to plug this into this, and we're going to use this for our y and change it. Let me straighten these out just a little bit. So let's go over to our shaders and Shift Control click to view the y. We'll go to our cylinder and do the same so that we can match what's happening on our cylinder. Select our curve again, tab into that, tab into that. Over here it's at 0, and over here it's at 1/4. So we want that to be our new 0 now in order to match what's happening down here. So all we have to do is add 1/4 to both of these. So add 0.25 to that, which is 0.25, and add 0.25 to 5, making it 0.75. And now that matches our y. Now, if we just Shift Control once or twice on our attribute node, and then do similarly on our cylinder a few times until we view object, they match. We're almost there. There's a few things that we still need to do. The problem now is, if we take our curve and tab into edit mode, and if we press Alt-S to scale this down, and if we do similarly with our curve, tab into edit mode and S to scale, and Shift-Z, and Shift-Alt-Z so we don't see everything, we notice that our cylinder is darker. That is because it doesn't reach a value of 1 because it's only only 1/4 the width. It's only 0.25. What we could do, this is an option that you will have available on your node if you do what I'm doing. Tab out of edit mode on our cylinder and select our curve. What we need to do is get our group to detect how thick the curve is, and then use that so that it doesn't stay at a value of 1 on the sides, that if it scales up or scales down, those values will go up or down as well. Let's tab into edit mode. We're going to capture another attribute. Shift D, duplicate this. It could be before or after this, it doesn't matter, but it looks a little more tidy if it's over here. Shift A, S to search for radius. Capture the attribute of radius. And this will tell, even if one part of the curve is thicker or thinner than the other one, this will detect that. So we want to manipulate these two, and actually while we're doing it, let's tab into this group, bring up our properties and go to group, double click on our first attribute here and call it X, double click on our second one and call it Y. That way it's easier to read. Add a math node, set it to multiply, H to hide it just so that it doesn't take up so much space, put it over this X value, and Shift D, put it over our Y. We are going to multiply both of these by our radius. Now let's actually visualize this. So plug this into the second value of both our multiply, and we already see our x-axis looks correct. So what I'm going to do is make this controllable from the outside. We're going to have that little checkbox. Shift A, search for a switch node. We have to change this from geometry to float first, and we're going to plug this into our first one, and we're going to set this to 1 for now, and we're going to plug that into our second multiply sockets. But we want this to be controllable from the outside, so we're going to find one of our inputs, Shift D to copy it over here. Actually, before we do that, let's add another input that I know we're going to need later, this fill caps. We're going to make that controllable from the outside too, so let's put that in there. We'll tidy all of this up a little bit later. So plug another input into this switch. Let's rename that name this to fixed. So now if fixed is unchecked, this value will change depending on how thick or thin it is. But if it is checked, then it will be this value, which we also want to control from the outside. So I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit. One thing I will do is I'll copy this over here and have our fixed switch go up here. Press Control H on this and Control H on that so that we don't see all the stuff that we don't need. Hide this so it's a little bit smaller and hide that. Select all of these, Control J to put them in a frame. F2, I'm going to call it radius. I'm going to select these, Control J, and I'm going to call these ones length. Select that, F2, length. Now that we've done that, we're going to do something similar to the length. We want there to be a difference if the end of the curve always stays at a value of 1, or if that value grows depending on how long or short the curve is. I'm going to copy this output a couple of times, Shift A, S to search for another switch node, and we're going to set it to float so that it's a value. And we actually want it to be the factor if it's checked on so that the textures will stretch. And if it's off, we want it to be length. But we also want to be able to control the factor. Add a math node, and we're going to set it to multiply, and we're going to plug factor into that. We're going to set it to 1 by default, and then plug that into the true. I'm actually going to copy this and plug the factor into that and take that out so that it's also a little easier to read. Select both of these, Control H. We're going to add another value so that that is controllable from the outside. Press N. Let me Control Space to maximize this. With that value, we're going to rename it to length vector, actually. You can rename it in either of these places. The one that we made a while ago, I'm going to call that radius vector. And I'm actually going to put that one lower than the length vector. I'm going to select all of these inputs that I made, press Control H a couple of times so that we only see the stuff that we need. This one we haven't done anything with yet. We're going to take our fixed check mark box and plug that into this switch node. I'm going to tidy everything up. I'm going to tidy them up a little bit more. We're going to shift and left drag over our z-axis here and put it under here so that we can see what's happening. Shift right click drag. I meant to say, I don't know if that's what I just said or not. And let me tidy these up. So now let me show you what we've just done. If we plug a texture into this, let's Shift A, S to search for, say a Voronoi texture. Make sure that our vector is plugged into that. Now if we visualize this, if fixed is unchecked, if we change the width or the length, the dimensions of the little elements in the textures remain the same. Maybe our thing is animated and it gets bigger or longer and we want our textures to stay the same. All we have to do is check fixed, and now if we change the length or the thickness of it, our texture remains the same, but we still have control. Maybe we don't want these spots to be stretched out like that. We want it to be this length maybe, and we want it to stretch and compress from there. We could take our, say, our length value and turn it up until the spots are the size that we want, or maybe we can keep them a little bit higher and then turn the radius value down so that those spots are where we want them to be. And then we can stretch and compress or thicken or thin from there. So now we have that flexibility. But now let me show you, in case you don't know, how you can use this in other projects easily. If you haven't used the asset library before, this is how you set it up. Go to Edit, Preferences. And if you go to File Paths, you notice there's this section called Asset Libraries. You can select a folder or some folders. I just have my whole projects folder selected right now so that anything that is saved in that folder, if you mark it as an asset, you can use it in other projects that you're working on. It might be better to have one smaller specific file for it, because I noticed Blender is a little bit slow for me because it seems like it's constantly searching through all of the files in my project files for assets. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I've just started playing around with it. And then you can name it Asset Library, My Assets, My Library, whatever. And now we're going to do something that hopefully you've been doing. We're going to save our file. So we're going to Control S, and I'm going to save it in my assets folder, even though I use the whole projects file. I'm going to name it curve vectors. I'm going to copy the name of this file that I did in a previous recording, save it there. And now you can pull up another window by just clicking and dragging in the corner. I don't need to because I already have a window. You can change that window to Asset Browser. Instead of looking at assets in your current file, you want to make sure you're looking in your asset library. If we go to our node and hover over the name field, right click, we can mark it as an asset. And now we notice that it shows up here, and I want to put this in geometry. So if you want to create a new file, a new assortion of assets, press this little plus button, and I'm going to create one called geometry. And right now this node is here, but it's not assigned to one of these folders. So go to unassigned and click and drag our curve vectors one over to geometry. There's a little asterisk after the name because we have to Control S and save the file, and now there's no asterisk there. And that means that if you're working on another project and you go to your little geometry folder here in your asset browser, this curve vector will be here, and you can drag and drop it into any curve that you have made. Let's do that actually. File, New, General. If we go to Geometry Nodes and add a new Geometry Nodes to our cube, cut that, Shift A, search for a spiral, plug that into our output. We can bring up our asset browser, make sure we're looking in Asset Library. I need to make that default. And now we can drag our curve vectors in, and then we can drag it over that connection and go to Material Preview, add a texture. Shift A, S to search for checker texture. Plug this color into our base color. Shift A, S to search for set material, of course. Select our material. At first we see our checkered pattern not conforming to the shape. So in our geometry nodes, add Shift A, S to search for store named attribute. Put that there and change it to vector. Plug that in there. Name this curve vector or whatever you want to call it. Select all that, copy it. Go to our shaders. Shift A, S to search for attribute. Paste our name in there and plug the vector into the vector. Control Shift and view the vectors of this. And I believe the problem is Shift A, S to search for set radius so that we can control the radius of this object in here. Maybe our attribute name isn't working. Maybe we didn't set a name. Look at that. So we can just copy the name from this one, paste it in there. We have to press enter when we're storing a named attribute. When we give it a name, we have to press enter or click on the name itself so that that name is actually saved. Now, what can you use this for? Let me show you some examples if I can remember which of these files. So with these vectors, for example, you can differentiate the underside or the belly and give it a lighter color like I have on these tiger stripes. You can tell these stripes to end. Voronoi texture for draft spots, but on the belly, there's less spots and it gets lighter. And this one is fun. I've tried to emulate a thylacine. Now, a thylacine is a marsupial like a kangaroo, but it's called the Tasmanian wolf because it kind of looks like a dog-like animal. Humans drove it to extinction 100 years ago, as humans do. Thylacines have longer stripes toward their rump, and since I have control over the length parameter of the curve, I can use that to manipulate the length of the stripes. Let's see what else I have here. Sort of corn cob. I guess if we made this sort of a dark green color, we could have crocodile scales. You could even make a rope. You can use these vectors and make a sort sort of a spiral form. Maybe you want to make, instead of having stripes go around, maybe you want the texture to be longer with the length of it, kind of like tree bark. Let me check fixed here because I think that's how I made this. So now if we look at our object that's kind of emulating a tree here, now you can see that the bark pattern that I've made with the noise texture is stretched along so that it's kind of a longer pattern. You can access the interior, so if you have fill caps enabled, you can make some stuff in there, or if you want the texture to be flattened instead, kind of like an aspen, I just threw this one together. Little spots on it, but they're squished. So there's a lot of fun and useful stuff you can do with this. And if you all want to see a tutorial about how I made some of these patterns here, let me know. Maybe that'll be something in the future. I'm sure you guys are a lot smarter than me, so you can figure out how to do a lot of cool stuff with this. So I hope that I've taught you something that enables you. Again, if you support me on Patreon, you'll be able to download this little asset without even having to work for it. And if not, I hope that what I've taught you today can enable you to do some really cool stuff. So thanks for watching.